Hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar on PMP prep course from Hands-on Agile Coaching. Before we proceed, let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Janakiram and I'm shortly known as JD. I'm based out of a city called Hyderabad in India and I have more than 18 plus years of experience in the software industry. Primarily, I played the role of a project manager. I got PMP certified in the year 2014 and I'm also certified on PMI ACP, which is for Agile practitioners. I am also an authorized trainer from PMI on PMP. I'm also an alumni of Certified Scrum Master from Scrum Alliance. And during my good old programming days, I used to be a Microsoft certified solution developer. And I, and I have also authored a book called Practical Agile for Beginners. This is particularly for people who are new to Agile and who are willing to explore the length and breadth of Agile practice. Here is the agenda for today. At first, we'll talk about some basics like what exactly is a project and what happens within a project lifecycle. And then we'll talk about who is a project manager and what kind of roles and responsibilities does he do. And finally, we talk about the PMP certification and all about our PMP prep course. Let's start with the basics. Now, what exactly is a project? There are various frameworks that have many formal definitions. Let's look at the most popular definition. The PMBOK guide is a flagship publication from Project Management Institute, which is a golden standard for project management. Now, the PMBOK guide says project is a temporary endeavor, right? Endeavor is an initiative. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. At first glance, this definition looks very simple, but the words that are used here have a lot of weightage. If you look at the first word, it says a project is a temporary endeavor. Now, what do you mean by temporary? Anything that is temporary certainly has a start date and end date, right? Anything that is temporary will not be running indefinitely, right? So what they're trying to say here is a project has a certain start date and a certain end date. And it makes sense, isn't it? Projects are investments, right? Companies invest into projects to achieve something, to derive some value. So projects have start dates and end dates, and they produce a unique outcome. The outcome can be a product, right? Like a mobile app or like a consumer product into the market. The outcome can also be a service. I have many students who are into event management, wedding planners, right? So they run these events as a project, but the outcome is a service, right? It's not a product as such. And finally, a result. Sometimes you might have to undertake projects to deliver certain results, right? So, for example, the last project I worked on, I was asked to increase the quality of a particular product, right? So the outcome is neither product or service. They wanted me to increase the quality, right? They are expecting certain result as an outcome of a project. Simple. Now, project characteristics, if we summarize that projects are temporary, every project has its own goals, right? So it is unique and has a goal or objective. And projects are aligned with org strategy. Every organization has the vision and strategy, and the project gets aligned with the organization vision and strategy. Now, we understand what is a project. Now, let us look at some examples. Construction of a house is a project, right? The goal is to build a house as per the specification in architecture, and you have a specific timeline and a budget allocated. Classic example of a project. Launching of a satellite, launching of a mobile application, right? This is a classic example of a project whose outcome is a product. Likewise, construction of a dam. Now that we know what is a project, let's try and understand what happens inside a project, the project lifecycle. Now, there are many frameworks that has different prescriptions of a project lifecycle. We are going into We are going to consider the standard definition of a project life cycle from Project Management Institute, right? And this is quite popular across the world. The Project Management Institute has divided a project life cycle into five process groups. You can also say five phases. It says project starts with the initiation phase, followed by the planning phase, followed by the execution phase, and execution phase runs in parallel to the monitor and control phase, and finally you get to close your project. Now, let's dive deeper into each of these process groups or phases. The first phase or process group in a project is the initiation phase. The initiation phase is where you do your groundwork. You cannot right away start planning for your project. You got to understand what are the project goals, schedule constraints, budget constraints, identify the right stakeholders. You need to do certain groundwork before you start planning. So what do you do in initiation? You would come up with a project charter. Project charter is a summary information about the project. So it talks about what are the goals of a project, what are the objectives of a project, what is the success criteria of the project, who are the key stakeholders of the project, what are the high level risks, who is the project manager for the project, right? So the project manager gets authorized through a project charter document. So project charter document is kind of an authoritative document that gives the authority for the project to be started. In project initiation, you would also start engaging the stakeholders. The sooner that you engage the stakeholders, the better. You do not want to end up identifying stakeholders in the later stages of your project, and those stakeholders introducing change at that point of time would prove very costly. You'll start engaging the stakeholders here. You'll conduct a kickoff meeting. Kickoff meeting is the first formal meeting in a project where all the stakeholders identified are invited to this meeting and they are communicated on the goals, objectives, and vision of the project so that you have all the stakeholders on the same page with respect to the expectations on the project. And you may also have to undergo knowledge transfer from the sales team, particularly in those cases where the project has been brought into the organization by the sales team. It doesn't apply to every project, but only in those cases. Now that we understand that project initiation, the stage is where you do the groundwork before you start planning for the project. The next phase is the planning phase, of course. The planning phase is pretty straightforward. Here, you would come up with all the plans for the project. When I say all the plans, if you look at the PMI terminology, you would come up with a management plan for every aspect of the project. For example, you'll come up with the scope management plan. You'll also come up with the schedule management plan. You will also come up with the cost management plan, right? And there are dozens of management plans. You have the procurement management plan or contract management plan. You have the requirement management plan. You have the quality management plan. You have the stakeholder engagement plan. You have the risk management plan, and you have the quality management plan, and you have the configuration management plan, change management plan. There are dozens of management plans. As a project manager, you will prepare a management plan for each of these aspects. And then what would you do? You would baseline those plans. What do you mean by baseline? Baseline is getting those plans approved. Af- After all, plans that are not approved do not make sense. Particularly, you need to get them reviewed and approved by the customers. You can also say baseline means commitment, or in general project management terminology, we say baseline means freezing, right? Freezing the requirement, freezing the scope, freezing the cost, whatever you would like to call that. So the summary here is come up with the plans and then get them approved. The second important aspect in your project planning is to develop the WBS. WBS stands for work breakdown structure, which is nothing but a fancy name for list of deliverables. Ultimately, your project would be judged by what you deliver. You would get the requirements as input, but these requirements have to be translated into deliverables. So you need to be pretty sure as to what are the list of deliverables before you start executing your project. So there is no discrepancy between what the customer has been expecting and what is it that you are building as a project team. And finally, the planning phase is a great phase for you to identify and document the roles and responsibilities of the stakeholders. You don't want to figure out these things while you're executing the project, because if you have loosely defined roles and responsibilities, there are higher chances of stakeholders ending up with conflicts. People would stop People would start stamping on each other's toes, creating conflicts. All right. So in project planning, you'll come up with plans, baseline them or get those plans approved, and it's very important that you also identify the list of deliverables. In the execution phase, it's very simple. You will just follow the plans that you identified in the planning phase. On top of that, you would monitor and handle risks, right? Well, is it so black and white? Not really. There are gray areas as well. Let me ask you a question. Is it always that whatever you have planned for a project goes as per the plan? Not every time, right? So we have exceptions. So you see there is one more phase running in parallel to execution called monitor and control. This is particularly needed when you are finding some deviation from the plan and execution, right? So if there is a deviation from the plan, you need to course correct. You need to bring back the project back to the plan or re-baseline your plan, isn't it? This is exactly what we call as change management. Change management is any unapproved work being introduced during execution. We'll talk more about it shortly in a couple of slides from now. So in monitor and control phase, you will perform change management, and you would also be communicating project progress reports to stakeholders. And finally, you would close the project. You would close the project in two occasions. Once, if you have achieved the goals of the project, you would close it, or for some reason, you are terminating a project midway, right? So let's hope you are closing your project because you have achieved the goals. Now, what would you need? You would need formal acceptance from users or stakeholders, without which you cannot close a project. As a part of project closure, you may hand over to operations if you have an operations team waiting for you to hand over and for them to take over. If there are open contracts, you will close the contracts and you would archive any documents, deliverables, and artifacts. Typically, the project management office would take over the documentation and the artifacts from the project. And that's it. These are the five typical phases or process groups in the project lifecycle. Now, we understand what is a project. We understand what happens inside a project lifecycle. Let's understand who is a project manager and what are his roles and responsibilities. The project manager, by now, you might have guessed and understood, he is responsible for whatever we have spoken so far in the life cycle, isn't it? So the key word here is responsible. The project manager is responsible for planning, organizing, and overseeing the execution of the project from start to finish, ensuring it meets objectives, isn't it? Project management is responsible for the project, but the more apt sentence would be the project manager is responsible for the project's success, right? Make sure that you stay on schedule and within the budget expectations. This is quite understandable, but let's go a bit deeper and understand what are the various roles and responsibilities that the project manager holds. Now, I'm going to skim through the surface, right? There, you see here on screen, project management is responsible for resource management, scope management, schedule management, cost, change, risk, right? Now, is it all? Not really. There are more than this that a project manager does, but these are very important. So we are going to talk about this. Let's start with resource management. Now, let me break some myths, right? When we talk about resource, there's a general thought process that resource means people alone. But what PMI recommends, when you say managing resources, it's not only people, it includes equipment and material, right? People means human resources, Equipment means your project might need some equipment, like, for example, um, laptops, right, or desktops, or servers, or even mobile devices. Material, right? Material depends upon the type of project. For example, in construction projects, you would need raw material like sand or cement, right? Or paint. So, depending on the type of project, you may need a combination of these resources. Now, why should we consider all these things as resources? We need to consider them because they are going to cost you people, equipment, material. Whether you are going to hire them permanently or whether you're going to borrow them from a resource pool, they're not going to come for free. They are going to cost your project, right? So you need to make sure when you estimate for resources, you consider all these three factors. Now, how do you estimate for resources, right? The first thing that you need to know are your resource requirements. What kind of resources do you need? And one such example here is resource breakdown structure. In resource breakdown structure, if you look at this, you can clearly see that you have divided your resource requirements into people, material, and equipment. And you're very specific here, right? In people, I need two people in role one, out of which one person is level one and the other person is on level two. I need one more person in role two and one more person in role three. When it comes to material, I need one material and the second material should be of grade 2. When it comes to equipment, I need equipment 1 and 2, right? And it goes on. Now, breakdown structure is only to give you an idea of your resource requirement. There is one more tool called resource histogram where you are even more specific. And this is my personal favorite, and my management always loved this report. In resource histogram, you are being more optimal in your estimation. You are specifying when do you need these resources and how many. If you look at this example, I know for sure I need an architect, a project manager, team lead, developers, and testers, right? Do I need them throughout the project? Not really. If you look at January, I need an architect, a project manager, a team lead, and a developer. In February, I'm adding one more developer and a tester. In March, I'm adding three more developers and an additional tester. In April, I'm letting go of my architect and I'm adding one more tester. I'm continuing to use the same composition of the team for May, and in June, I'm sizing down my team all the way till July, probably because I'm closing the project. Probably it's in the acceptance testing stage here, and probably because I'm on warranty here, right? So the whole idea here is you don't need all these resources throughout. So you don't want to blow up your estimates, optimally estimate and let the company know when do you need these resources and for how long. Like I said, my senior management always loved this resource histogram because I'm being more specific. Okay, so that's resource management, right? Estimating the resources. But how do you know how many resources you need? For that, you need to understand the scope. What is it that you have to deliver? And if you look at this, scope, schedule, and cost together is called the golden triangle in project management. And people also call this as triple constraints. Triple constraints. A project manager is a juggler who juggles between these three: scope, schedule, and cost. Okay, so let's start with scope management, right? Now, in real world, the word scope and the word requirement are used interchangeably. I'll not blame anyone here. That's the way we have been conditioned. But there is a difference between scope and requirement. Let's try to understand what the difference is. Scope defines boundaries. Okay. Scope says what are the list of deliverables I need, and you got to be specific about this, right? Remember, project is like a contract between customer and the project team. You got to be specific about what is it that the customer is expecting and what is it that you are delivering, right? So both of this should be matching, isn't it? So it talks about boundaries. When I say boundaries, I mean what goes inside the project, what goes outside the project, what is in scope, what is out of scope. Whereas requirement, it deals with the behavior of the product, right? For example, my list of deliverables may contain that I need to deliver a login screen. I need to deliver a register new user screen. I need to deliver a landing screen. I need to deliver a search screen, right? Now, scope talks about what needs to be delivered. Requirement talks about behavior, right? For example, my requirement may say the login screen should have a username and password field. The login screen should have a submit and cancel button, right? The login screen should say when I present the right username and password and click on submit, I should be taken to the landing page, right? But when I give a wrong username and password, I should be shown an error message. You get the idea, isn't it? So requirement is all about behavior, scope is all about how many and what to be delivered. Now, when you talk about scope management, there are some popular terms out there. There is something called scope creep. Scope creep is unplanned work being introduced unofficially, right? For example, let's say the customer has approved 100 deliverables as part of the project, right? Now, when you're executing your project, if a customer silently introduces additional 20 deliverables, right, without your knowledge as a project manager or the project manager, this is what we call it as scope creep, right? So ideally, these 20 deliverables should have been added officially or formally, and that should consider additional cost and additional duration or timeline, right? So scope creep is bad. It eats up into your project cost and schedule. It also stresses out the team. A project manager should try and avoid it. So what should you do when a scope creep happens? Should you reject the request? No. Scope creep should be translated into a change request. I'll talk about change request in a couple of slides from now. Right. Now, the takeaway here is scope creep is bad. Now there is one more popular term called goal plating. Now it's similar to scope creep, except that it comes from the other direction. Scope creep gets introduced by the customer onto the project team. Goal plating comes from the project team onto the customer. In goal plating, the project team delivers extra features without the customer asking for it. Now, is it good or bad? PMI says this is bad. Now, I know in real life, a lot of projects does this maybe to impress the customer for future business. Nothing wrong in that, but keep in mind that as a global standard, this is considered as a bad practice. Probably for the reason that in your enthusiasm to deliver extra features, you may compromise with your actual committed scope. That happens quite a lot from what I've seen in my experience. On top of that, uh, most of the popular frameworks out there uh, recommend that you keep your commitment simple. Deliver what you promised and keep it simple. Do not complicate that. So goal plating is also considered as a bad practice. Now, as a part of your scope management, you would also identify the list of deliverables. Like I said, the fancy name for the list of deliverables identified in a project is called work breakdown structure. In work breakdown structure, you will split the scope all the way till you identify a list of deliverables, right? So if you look at here, we have the project scope gets split into control accounts and planning packages, and finally you identify the work packages. Work packages, the last layer that you see here, these are the deliverables. Without identifying the list of deliverables and getting them reviewed and approved by the customer, it doesn't make sense to proceed to the execution phase. So this is a must-have step in scope management. And that's it. Scope management deals with how much you are going to deliver, right? Now, what's equally important is by when you are going to deliver, which is nothing but your schedule management. In schedule management, you're talking about the project timeline. Now, there are popular representations of project timeline. One such representation is what we call it as milestone chart. In milestone chart, we we present the milestones. So this is also known as milestone report. If you represent it in a tabular form, it's called as milestone list. So what is a milestone? Milestone is an achievement, an expected achievement. So in milestone chart, you would only highlight the expected achievement by a certain date. You would not be bothered about other activities, right? For example, whatever may happen here, right? The list of activities, you'll not be displaying them here. You would only be displaying what you achieve here. Similarly, right? If you see here, a lot of activities happen here, and finally you complete development. A lot of activities happen here, you complete UAT. A lot of activities happen here, and you release. So milestone chart is typically liked by senior management because they do not have the time to go through every low level activity that you are trying to present. They would like to know the highlights and they would like to know our progress towards those highlights. Another popular representation in schedule is what we call it as Gantt chart. In Gantt chart, you have the timeline and you have the list of activities. And what you see in between is the planned schedule versus actual schedule. Okay. Now, if you see here, activity A is planned to start in the first week and get finished by the eighth week. And if you see the actual progress, we are only 75% done, right? It's slightly lagging behind, isn't it? Activity B is a red flag. We're supposed to complete it by the third week. We are into the eighth week. We are only 65% done. Activity C is slightly lagging behind. Activity D is a red flag again. We're supposed to start by the fourth week, and we are only we are 0% complete. This is a red flag, right? So this is how effective Gantt chart is in a single presentation. You can see the list of activities, the timeline, the planned schedule plan the schedule for every activity and the actual progress for every activity. It's quite popular in project presentations. Now, when you present your schedule to stakeholders or customers, they may you might be quite familiar with the fact that some of them may ask you to reduce the schedule duration. If you look at this example, the actual schedule that has been presented to a customer says the duration is 15 weeks. Now, what if the customer asks you to reduce this duration? We have two options, and this is what we call it as schedule compression. We have two options in schedule compression: fast tracking and crashing. In fast tracking, you will try to parallelize the activities. You will try to run these activities more in parallel. As a result, you would end up delivering no much earlier in the timeline. In this example, uh, it would come to 11 weeks from 15 weeks, which is good, right? But the con here is when you're trying to parallelize too much, you will end up impacting the quality, right? There is high risk of the quality getting impacted. Or you have one more option called crashing. In crashing, you are adding additional resources. Now, additional resources would mean lesser time, and in this scenario, you are delivering the project in 10 weeks instead of 15 weeks, which is great, but additional resources are going to cost you, like how we have discussed in resource management. So it so which one would you prefer? It all depends on scenario, what works for you. You may also use a combination of both, right? Few of the activities you may fast track, few of the activities you may want to crash. Now that's about schedule mod. And finally, among the constraints, this is the most important. Cost. Everything boils down to the cost because, like I said, projects are business investments. Now, cost management in comparison to schedule is less complex and simpler. All that you need is the WBS, right? In scope management, we came up with the WBS. You need this WBS in schedule, you need this WBS in cost. Now, how would this work? In cost baseline, you would estimate for every activity in your WBS and sum it up. On top of that, add a contingency reserve. Contingency reserve is the money that you're putting aside for any known risk, right? So you're adding up at an activity level and you're adding up some money for any known risk. Now, you would also sum it up to a work package level in the WBS. On top of that, you have one more contingency reserve, or if you have any known risk at a work package level, you would also set aside some money or funds to handle those risks, right? So with that, you get your cost baseline. On top of the cost baseline, you will add management risk. No, I'm sorry, management reserve. Management reserve is the money that you're putting aside for unknown risks. Unknown risks. Now, what are unknown risks, right? Known risk is something that you can foresee, right? For example, if one of your team members is a flight risk, right? If he is looking for a job outside your project, then that is going to impact your project. It's the known risk. Or if you are dependent on another project and that project is having a risk of delay, then you can foresee that it is going to impact your project. But what about unknown risk? Unknown risk is something you cannot foresee, right? Like natural disasters, if it impacts your project. COVID-19 pandemic impacted a lot of projects across the world, right? So these come under unknown risk. You need to put aside some money for dealing with unknown risk. The industry standard is to put 10 to 15% of the cost baseline as a management reserve for handling unknown risk. Right? So that's about cost management. We are done with the triple constraints. We identified the WBS, we have estimated the cost and schedule. Now it's time to execute the project, right? Provided you have baselined or got this cost, schedule, and scope approved by the customer, you can start executing the project. Now, like I said, when you are executing the project, if there are any unplanned work being introduced, you would be dealing with change management and change request. So in change management, you would be dealing with change request. What is a change request? Any unapproved work introduced during project execution is change request. The keywords here are unapproved work and execution, right? It's called change request. Now, what qualifies as a change request? There are four categories, right? The first one is corrective action. Corrective action is reactive. If your project has deviated from the plan and you have realized it after the deviation, you'll try to correct the project. You'll try to course correct the project, right? So the action that you take to course correct the project is a change request. Now, sometimes you may foresee the deviation. Here you are being proactive. You foresee that your project may get deviated in the future, and to avoid that, let's say that you have raised a change request, that is preventive action. Now, defect repair are also considered as change request. Why? Because you never planned for defects, right? So they are unapproved work being introduced during execution. If you plan for defects, you're planning for poor quality. That never happens, isn't it? So technically, defect repairs are also change requests. And finally, updates. A lot of times we have to deliberately update the project plan, right? Like I said, the customer may come in and give you additional requirements, and for him it is critical. You cannot say no. Now you need to take it as a change request. Now we understand what is change management and change request, but how does it work? What is the process? Let me show you a typical process. Now this is not a gold standard, but this is a typical process. In a change control process, the stakeholder will raise a change request and put it in a change log. In the change log, you have all the unapproved change requests. Now you have a charter team here. There is a charter team called change control board. Change Control Board is also known as CCB, right? So the change request submitted by the stakeholder is subject to impact analysis, right? So what is the impact of the change request if we entertain the change request? Is it going to impact the cost? Is it going to impact the quality? Is it going to impact the schedule? So the change, the impact is documented and presented to the CCB. The CCB contains the project manager, the project sponsor, other stakeholders and team representatives. Sometimes you also have the project management office representatives. So the CCB would review the change request, and if they think that the change is too risky, they may reject it. If they reject it, the stakeholders get a communication notification. But if they approve the change request, the change is scheduled to be executed. And once the change is executed, you would re-baseline the project. And finally, risk management. In my personal opinion, most of the project manager's job is to handle change management and risk management. If you are good in change management, risk management, you are a great project manager. Like I said, that's my personal opinion. Now, what is risk management? Let's understand what is risk. Risk is an uncertain event. Remember, risk is never 100% probable. Okay, it is an uncertain event. The probability is anywhere between 1% to 99%. An uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative impact. This is something I would like to highlight. In real world, we all have been conditioned to think that risk is, you should only consider negative impacts as risk, right? Whereas popular frameworks like PMI and PMBOK, they also recommend us to consider positive impacts as risks. Positive risks are called opportunities, negative risks are called threats. A project manager would like to make opportunities happen. He will try to make and exploit opportunities. Whereas the same project manager would like to avoid the threats, avoid threats or mitigate and manage them. He doesn't like negative risks. A good project manager will look out for both positive and negative risks. So what exactly is a risk management process? The risk management process starts with identification of risks. And once you identify the risk, you need to analyze the risk. To analyze the risk, you would be looking at probability and impact, and you would prioritize risks. You might have identified 100 risks. You'll not be able to handle them in parallel. You would have to prioritize them. And once you prioritize them, you would start responding to them. You would start responding by dealing with the high priority risk first and going down in the descending order. Does it end there? Not really. You need to constantly monitor for new risks. Now, this is the entire life cycle of risk management. Now, where do you track a risk? The formal name for the artifact from PMI for tracking risk is called risk register. It looks something like this. You have the risk description, the date it got reported, the probability and impact. These both are the key characteristics of a risk. You need to consider and balance both these aspects. What is the probability? What is the certainty of a risk? And what is the impact? What if the risk happens? What is the impact? It could be monetary impact, it could be impact on the schedule, it could be impact on the quality, but you should be able to track it here in risk register. Now, the risk register may have additional columns like what is the current status of the risk and who is the owner of the risk, what is the response mitigation plan for the risk. You may want to add those columns. Now, risk is also closely associated with issue. I told you earlier that risks have a probability of anywhere between 1% to 99%. But what if something is 100% certain? If something is 100% certain, you call it as an issue, right? In other words, if you do not handle a issue properly, it may get converted into an issue. A risk, today's risks are potential issues of tomorrow. So a good project manager will try to handle the risk as soon as possible, right? The differences between risks and issues. Risks are focused on the future, whereas issues are certain events on the present. Risks can be both positive or negative. Issues are always negative. There is no such thing as a positive issue. You document risk in a risk register, you document issues in an issue log, and the response to a risk is what we call it as risk response, and the response to a issue is what we call a workaround. All right, in summary, those are the high level responsibilities of a project manager. Like I said, he may have additional roles like quality management, contract management, stakeholder engagement, communication management, and so on. Now, let's talk about the benefits of PMP. Before we talk about the PMP prep course, what are the benefits of PMP? Is PMP worth the investment of time and money? Let's look at some statistics and numbers. Now, PMI conducts two surveys once in every couple of years. The first survey is called Project Management Salary Survey. Now, the last survey has found something interesting. It says on a global average, a PMP certified project manager earns 33% higher than a non PMP certified project manager. And keep in mind, this is a global average. In certain geographies, the numbers are staggering. In North America and Africa and even in India, the numbers are going anywhere above 40% to 50%. That's quite an encouraging number. Now, as we speak, there are 1.5 million active project management professional certification holders across the world. Now, the numbers might look a bit crowded, right? Does it mean that project management as a job is saturated? It's quite the opposite. PMI conducts one more survey called Pulse of Profession Survey, where they found out that in by 2030 there is a need for 25 million new project managers across the globe. Now this had been consistent, this number had been consistent for the past couple of surveys. So this is a reliable number. Now if you compare these both numbers, right, the demand versus supply, there is a huge gap, right? We are talking about 1.5 million professional project managers against 25 million new project management roles. The demand is way more higher than the supply. So if you are planning to establish a career in project management, there is no better time than this. And many of you might have heard that PMP happens to be the leading project management certification in the world, and it's been that way since 20 plus years. And there is a reason for that. The syllabus for PMP is quite comprehensive. Other project management frameworks do not come closer. The PMP syllabus uh, it sounds like a mini MBA, right? I playfully call PMP as mini MBA in project management. Now, there you go. These numbers are very encouraging and very positive. This is the right time for you to pursue a career in project management if that is what your passion is. Now, what do we offer in our prep course for the PMP certification? You would get the 35 PDUs for PMP. This is the qualification for the 35-hour project management course for the PMP certification. Now, we would cover the entire PMI PIMBOK syllabus as part of this course. On top of that, you would get hands-on training on Microsoft project software, particularly on waterfall projects. You would also get hands-on training in Atlassian Jira software for agile projects. On top of that, you would get access to learning management system where you have access to materials for you to prepare for the PMP exam, pre-recorded videos for you to refer, and 4 mock exams for you to practice before you go to the actual exam. Once the course is over, you would have access to the WhatsApp group where you can get your questions clarified while you are preparing for the exam. And you would also have access to the live recorded videos through Google Drive and other means. So that's about the course. If you're interested in the course, you can reach out to us in this email. You can WhatsApp us or call us. You can also explore our website and social media touch points. I am looking forward joining you in the course, and I wish you guys good luck in your career in project management. Thank you.